Welcome to another episode of SummitCast. In this show, we're going to be talking about, was there fraud in the 2020 elections? Well, actually, we're not going to be talking about that, and we'll tell you why in a minute. When we started planning this show about a week ago, we were thinking it would be interesting to talk about the allegations of fraud in the elections and try to sort out fact from fiction, what was true and what was not. But then YouTube came out with an announcement on Wednesday saying they weren't going to allow any discussion of fraud changing the outcome of the election. They've actually got the official YouTube announcement here. We will start removing any piece of content uploaded today or any time thereafter that misleads people by alleging that widespread fraud or errors change the outcome of the 2020 US presidential election. And then they do have a little caveat there. As always, news coverage and commentary on these issues can remain on our site if there's sufficient education, documentary, scientific or artistic content. So the problem with that is it's just that last bit is extremely subjective.
Yeah, exactly.
And what they say is if you're NBC or ABC or something like that, they'll let your content stand. But if you're not, they can take it down if they like.
So it's up to the gods of YouTube.
It's up to the gods of YouTube, yep. So it would have been interesting to do a show to talk about, analyze some of the different allegations that are around. There are so many different allegations.
So many outlandish claims.
Yeah.
So many that are taken without even looking at the merits.
Yeah. And so it would have been an interesting show, but I don't feel like I can do a show where we're only allowed to present one side of the story. So we've decided to do something else. And it's kind of an interesting strategy. It's I kind of think of it as the Venezuela strategy of dealing with election fraud.
Yes, exactly.
You make election fraud go away by making it illegal to talk about election fraud.
It's a smart plan.
Yeah, it works for Venezuela.
It works great for them.
Hopefully that's not where we're heading here. Although
he hasn't lost an election since.
That's right. He has not lost an election. So hopefully we're not going there. But this, because it's just the tech companies, and they're not throwing you in jail if you talk about election fraud. They're just not letting you talk about it. Whereas
they silence you.
They silence you. Whereas in Venezuela, they'll actually throw you in jail. And hopefully we're not there yet. But then this would have been kind of inconceivable a few months ago.
I think that is a major distinction, though. This idea that you can have a corporation that's silencing you versus in other countries where you don't have First Amendment protection, you actually can be jailed by the government. And I'm so happy to live in a place where people 200 years ago thought of things like this.
Yeah, I think the big problem though is that it tends to polarize the country even more. People who think there wasn't any fraud can be very happy on YouTube, and people who want to find out, look at the evidence, have to go somewhere else. So you're dividing people automatically by doing this.
Right.
A much better strategy would be, okay, well, if these claims are not genuine, let's actually discuss them, see what's real and what's not, which is what we were trying to do in this show. But you can't even do that anymore,
right?
Unless you come to the conclusions they like. So anyway, there are still some things we can talk about other than cat videos and the weather.
Or how to fix your car.
Or how to fix your car, yep. So what I want to talk about is I think maybe one thing to say is, encourage people to do their own research. There's videos on YouTube about why there isn't fraud. There are still any videos posted up to now, they say they're not going to take down. So you can do your research. I think one really good source is the Epoch Times. They've had a pretty kind of comprehensive coverage of all of the the claims of election fraud that seem to have some factual basis. Not all. I mean, I kind of researched a number of these to see what was behind them, and some of them, you do a bit of digging and you find out there really isn't anything there, or you look at the statistics or their data and some of their assumptions aren't right and so on. But Epoch Times actually seems to do a pretty good job. They cover them factually. They're not kind of hyping them. They'll give the counter evidence when that exists. So I think that's a good place to look if people want to do their own research, which I would encourage people to do. And
they definitely have kind of a more right-wing bias, I would say, right?
Oh, definitely. They have their bias. I mean, I don't know if you know their origin. It's Falun Gong people from China. Right. So they're very kind of exposing anti-communist, especially anti-China. So they're somewhat pro-Trump because he's taking a stand against China, and they're not happy about Biden because they figure he'll be cozying up to China as he did in the past. But you just got to take that into consideration as you do with any source you look at. But what I like is they'll actually talk about the facts, and if they and they have a minimum of commentary. Whereas if you look on CNN, you won't find all you'll find is opinion pieces about why these unnamed or claims of election fraud aren't valid. But they won't even tell you what the claims are, so you can draw your own conclusions. They won't give you counter evidence. They just will say, it's not valid. Don't bother looking there.
Don't look over there.
It's dangerous to look there, You
might be misled.
You might be misled. Trust us. We know what's true.
Yeah. I don't think I've ever trusted anyone who said, just trust us.
Yeah.
Just trust me. I'm not wired for that. So sorry. You're going to have to show me the evidence.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, definitely. But one place we can go, I think that will be YouTube safe, is there's an article from the New York Times in 2012 where they talk about the problems of election fraud with mail-in ballots.
All right.
So hopefully that will get past the YouTube censors.
It's not any specific fraud case. That we are just mentioning the possibility in an article from 2012.
And nothing to do with the current election.
Exactly.
Yeah. So let's have a look at that. The title of the article is Error and Fraud at Issue as Absentee Voting Rises. Just a few paragraphs I'm going to talk about here. One is they're talking about how absentee balloting and mail-in balloting is on the increase. And they say, the trend will probably result in more uncounted votes. That's one of the problems with mail-in balloting. I don't know if you saw that.
If the ballot gets lost?
No, well, in the mail, but that's not the biggest thing. For example, in the primary elections in New Jersey, something like 20% of the ballots were disqualified because the signature didn't match, or there wasn't a signature, or it didn't arrived after the cutoff date.
Right.
There were a lot of votes not counted. And so that's what they're talking about there.
It can be somewhat tricky, even in this election. When I took my ballot in, I received the mail ballot, and I took it into the office, and I asked the person at the office. I was like, okay, and then I put this envelope into this envelope, and I signed it, and I went through it because it can be a little bit confusing. When all these envelopes and the privacy envelopes are involved, and the signature and all of that. So I could see that. Even standing there in the office, it was confusing. And if you're expected to mail it in on your own and just read the instructions. Yeah, and a lot of ballots were disqualified for various reasons. Pennsylvania, for example, in the primary election, something like 1% of the, or could have been 2012, 1% of the mail-in ballots were disqualified, which is pretty low compared to the 20% in New Jersey. But in the general election, it was 0.03%. Really?
Yeah, so what they did is they basically just threw out all the reasons they disqualify things and let them all in.
So in the primaries, it was 1%.
Yeah.
And in the general election, it was 0.03.
Yeah.
Wow. It's terrifying even to hear of 1%. I mean, that's still a huge number of votes. Well, I guess in a primary, it's probably not that huge of a vote, but but in a general election, that would be a massive number.
What, 0.03%? No.
Well, no, 1%.
1%. Yeah, it would be a lot of votes. I mean, that could be more than the margin.
Easily, yeah.
Yeah, and you know, some of those, some of them could be thrown out for fraud because, like, the signature didn't match, somebody else sent it in, or some of them could be thrown out because the person didn't follow the technical rules.
Right.
You want to throw out the ones that are fraudulent,
Of course, yeah.
you know, but the thing is, you know, when it's to 0.03%, which they got to by basically getting rid of most of the safeguards, you don't know that they were actually excluding the fraudulent ones, which is the problem.
Okay. So that's what they're talking about. This were these stats, the 1% and 0.03, related to 2020 or related to 2012?
2020.
Okay, 2012. Okay.
Yeah, the recent election.
Right. Okay.
That was one of the things we might have talked about in more detail in our show.
Right.
So the next thing. Okay. While fraud in voting by mail is far less common than innocent errors, which is what we're talking about, people forget to sign it or they don't have the date or something like that, it is vastly more prevalent than the in-person voting fraud that has attracted far more attention, election administrators say. Voting by mail is now common enough and problematic enough that election experts say there have been multiple elections in which no one can say with confidence which candidate was the deserved winner. This includes, interestingly enough, the 2000 presidential election, in which problems with absentee ballots in Florida were a little noticed footnote to other issues. That's actually very interesting. You know, the margin in Florida was 252 votes or something like that in the end.
Tiny number, yeah.
Yeah, and there were, I read an article about this, there was something like 900 really questionable mail-in ballots.
Wow.
That were counted, you know, that people think maybe shouldn't have been counted, and which is more than the margin. And you don't know what percentage would have been for
either way, yeah.
Gore or Bush. So that's what they mean. You don't know what the real outcome of the election would be. And that's kind of what the Texas lawsuit in the Supreme Court is saying. You know, there are enough questionable ballots here that no one really knows what the outcome was.
Okay.
That's the issue. So, back to the article. There is bipartisan consensus that voting by mail, whatever its impact, is more easily abused than other forms. Back in 2012, that was bipartisan.
Bipartisan consensus. Is it still bipartisan consensus?
No.
It doesn't sound like it.
It doesn't sound like it, yeah. And interesting thing is, you know, if maybe we shouldn't go there.
If your guy wins, you're more likely to think everything went well.
Exactly. Well, yeah, that's the thing. I mean, Biden was saying before the election how they'd assembled the most, you know, the best voter fraud team ever. So what they were expecting, that there would be a lot of fraud, and they were ready to challenge it if they lost the election.
Right.
So it's just basically it's a mess.
It's an absolute mess. Yeah, and I think that's human nature, right? I mean, I think if Trump had won, or had won the election on that night, that the Democrats would have been making these exact same claims of fraud that the Republicans are now making. And I think it's just this.
They were certainly gearing up to do it.
Exactly. Yeah. People want their side to win and are willing to bend reality to fit that on both sides, I think.
I think that's very true, and I think it's probably in one sense it's the biggest problem, you know, that people are kind of willing to ignore reality or ignore facts that don't fit with their point of view. It's the confirmation bias, but it's kind of ramped up to a whole nother level. Right.
Yeah, I absolutely have friends that are Republican that would say absolutely there was fraud and this was a sham, yada yada yada. And I say, well, what is your evidence of that? Show me the evidence that you've seen.
Show me the money.
Yeah, show me the money. And often they can't come up with it, or it's circumstantial, and that's what's so frustrating is that I just want to know that our election was a good election.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, one thing that I think we can safely say for YouTube is that mail-in balloting was greatly expanded in leading up to this election.
Yeah.
And what you can say about it also is that, there are a lot of changes made in election procedures. One that really struck me before the election was when in Pennsylvania, not long before the election, there was a lawsuit which went to the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania.
Oh, yeah.
And they decided that they weren't going to do any signature verification, or you couldn't disqualify a ballot if the signature didn't match. And, leading up to the election, I wasn't really expecting fraud to be a major problem. I thought, it's probably not going to happen. But then when I saw that, I said, oh, my goodness.
You're opening the door.
It's opening the door, to fraud. I mean, what's the safeguard? I don't know if you saw there's a federal commission for electoral integrity or something. I can't remember what it's called. And the guy came out right after the election and said this was the most secure election we've ever had. And which he, without evidence, he said that, before even investigating or finding out what the claims were. Anyway, on that website, they said they had all the reasons why absentee ballots and mail-in balloting was secure. And one of the things they said was, in most states, signature verification is required.
Right.
I said, well, that's a factual statement, but it's misleading, because the problem is in the states that don't have it, and they're actually admitting that there are states that don't have it.
Right, which is terrifying to me.
Yeah, it's like mostly peaceful protests, right?
Peaceful until they're not.
It's a factual statement that most of them were peaceful, but mostly peaceful means sometimes violent, presumably.
Yeah.
But it's just got a very different.
I think having signature verification, having these systems, it seems so necessary. I mean, beyond necessary.
Yeah.
To my mind, it seems like, how can you have election without that being the cornerstone? I think also this idea that people are voting in different states, or that they've voted more than once. It seems to me that there's technical solutions to all of these. As a kind of a computer science kind of guy, that there's solutions to these problems that you could implement. Having your Social Security be a number that all states can have a database. That all states, when you vote, it's entered into a database that NOAA has voted. And then if I then try to vote again, either in the same state, so say I voted absentee, and now I voted in person, which I think a lot of states do have, where they'll just negate one of your votes or both of them. But if you had a central database, I mean, we have databases for everything in the United States, absolutely everything at the federal government level. So the states would still be in charge of their votes, but there would be a national database of whether you've voted or not. So if I vote in Montana, and then I previously lived in another address and I tried to vote there, the Montana would have already marked in the database that I have voted. It doesn't, it still keeps the privacy. It doesn't tell who I voted for or anything like that, so you don't have to worry about privacy. It just
or if you registered a new state, your registration in the old state would automatically get cancelled.
Yeah. Or and maybe even if it doesn't automatically get canceled, if you try to vote, it still won't allow it.
Yeah.
Because and I don't know how it would work, but it seems like combining that with the very controversial voter ID ideas. I think between those two things, if you're matching signatures, if you have voter ID, so that if you're in person, say, okay, yes, this is the NOAA that's registered to vote, database, date of birth matches. If you do those three things, I feel like voter fraud becomes a non-issue. And then we can all happily live in the world where votes are counted and we know they're. I mean, I guess this whole the idea that the computer systems themselves have been hacked or whatever would still be at play. But
we could actually do a show on that one. There's a lot to talk about there.
Are we allowed to talk about that?
In the abstract,
we can talk about
absent talking about any effect it might have had on the 2020 elections. We could talk about it theoretically.
Talk about hacking voter systems completely separate from any election, past or present or future.
Yes, the theoretical concept. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, we could talk about what happened in Venezuela.
Right, exactly. Yeah. But I think if you, going back to this idea, if you can have a federal voting database, I think you can rest assured that your vote has counted appropriately.
Yeah.
Which is what I want. That's what I want to know, that I got to vote once and everyone else got to vote once, and the will of the people was enacted.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things you can see is that there are a lot of there's been a push for a long time in a lot of different ways to weaken the election security, and it's always kind of cast in the with the aim of preventing people from getting disenfranchised.
Right.
Because disproportionately people of color don't have access to
like literacy testing,
or driver's license or whatever.
Oh yeah, well that's a whole nother issue.
Yeah.
That's the most obscene argument I've ever heard. that people of color don't have IDs. I say, well, how did you get your bank account? How do you fly on a plane? Or how do you anything in life without an ID? It's not possible.
Yeah, and I mean the way I look at it is they're wanting to increase voter participation by making it more convenient, right, and by getting rid of the things that are somewhat inconvenient, like having to have an ID.
Right.
And
minor inconvenience.
It's kind of like, I kind of think of the, that saying of Benjamin Franklin that it's better that 100 guilty people escape than one innocent person gets convicted.
Okay. No, I hadn't heard that one actually.
Yeah, it's kind of like it's a principle of the criminal justice system. That's why things are weighted in favor of defendants,
Right.
But in the case of voting, I'm not sure it's good that 100. You'd rather have 100 people vote fraudulently than have one person not vote because it was a little bit inconvenient.
But is it? Is it?
And that's
the question.
Well, that's just the argument that's made.
Where's the inconvenience in having an ID which is mandatory for life in the United States?
You left it at home that day.
You left it at home. Maybe you left your passport when you were going to get your license renewed.
Well, I'm just what I'm saying is this is what people argue, in favor of loosening restrictions.
Right.
These are the arguments they make. And I'm willing to concede that some of these people are really genuine in this belief.
Yeah, of course, yeah. Yeah, and I want the most people to vote as possible. And I'd love, to have better education on these issues. It seems, I feel like I follow politics moderately. It's definitely not, I'm not obsessed with it, but some of these ballot issues, when I go in to vote, I look at it and I'm like, I have no idea how I should vote on this, and I have to sit there and read the thing at the ballot poll. So I wish there was a way that we could promote education about what are the philosophies of the candidate you're voting for. Do they align with how you see the world and these ballot issues?
Yeah, and that's one of the problems with the media, really, in elections. There's hardly any coverage of the issues and the policies.
Yeah.
It's all the coverage is all about the politics and the polls and who's winning and in the PR thing. It's hardly any coverage of the
personality cult of who's a better person.
Yeah, and who's more popular and what are the polls saying, and and I think the media is doing a real disservice to the country by not covering the issues.
Yeah, it's just boring, right? I mean, it doesn't sell as well as, what's the latest scandal about Representative A or whatever.
Yeah. Getting back to the idea that, they'd rather have people be able to vote fraudulently than, or than people be disenfranchised. I guess one of these people would say, well, there's very little evidence of fraud. Most people are honest. And even if we do make it, remove some of the safeguards, there's still not going to be significant amounts of fraud because most people are honest. And I was thinking about that. I mean, what I would say was, well, okay, you live in New York City, most people are honest, so do you lock your apartment when you go out?
Right, yeah.
And
it doesn't take many in a city of 11 million people. It doesn't take many to to break that idea for you.
yeah, my father-in-law was a policeman. He used to say, "Locks keep honest people out."
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's what you're seeing, with these elections. You get rid of the safeguards, and then people who would normally be honest look for an opportunity to, they take the opportunities that are there because they're not going to get caught, or, there's nothing to prevent them.
Right.
And I think that's, on a societal level, I think that's maybe the biggest issue in general, is that kind of a lowering of the standards of integrity of people. That it's okay to cheat or to lie or not be honest if it gets the goal you want, gets your
The ends
goal.
justify the means, right?
The ends justify the means.
Right.
And
This guy's really bad, and we've got to get him out of office. So
whatever it takes.
Whatever it takes.
And, even the mainstream media is jumping on the bandwagon. It's okay to burn down buildings and destroy businesses, and if it helps get rid of Trump, or make your political. So, sending in a fake ballot is minor compared to burning down a building.
Yeah, it really, when you kind of think of who'd be willing to do the former versus the latter, yeah, it's I think a lot more people would be like, well, it's not that bad, and this person really is. Nobody's hurt, right?
And we get a better guy's president, so it's worth it.
Right.
Yeah. So I think, to me, it really is in a matter of integrity, ultimately, for the nation.
Right.
And that's something that everyone has to look at individually, and we have to look at it in our own lives.
Yeah.
Are we willing to ignore the truth if it's inconvenient? Are we willing to say something that's not quite true if it's if the goal is worthy?
Right. Well, and the margins are so, like you were saying, the 2000 presidential election, where it was 200, or I think there's a current race right now, is it in Vermont or in the Northeast somewhere, where there's an election that's separated by 12 votes or 6 votes or something. They're still counting. And it's just, that might have already been resolved. I know that was a couple of weeks ago I read that. But when the margins are so razor thin, it really can. They say, well, do you think there's enough voter fraud to sway an entire election? It doesn't take that much. At the end of the day, it really doesn't take that much to alter the result. So why not implement a system that puts all of those fears to rest?
Yeah. And I think we should do another show about that.
Yeah.
Talk about, what are the solutions going forward? We talked about it a little bit, but there's a lot more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. There's definite ways that can make us happy with the result. Like, even if your person doesn't win, you can know that the will of the people was carried out, and so it's like, okay, let's do this for 4 years.
Yeah, and hopefully that's something that everyone or most people could agree on.
Yeah.
They'd like to have honest elections.
Yeah.
So we'll leave it there, and we'll see you next time when we can talk some more about this subject.